walls and golden accents, a place whispered about in elite circles as a sanctuary for the wealthy and untouchable. Alexander stepped out of the car with the practiced confidence of a man who believed the world bent to his will. His tailored suit fit like it had been stitched onto his frame, the glint of his platinum cufflinks catching the morning light. Every movement spoke of wealth and authority, the kind that made people glance twice, then quickly look away, careful not to offend. Beside him slid out Vanessa, the mistress he paraded so openly it was almost a mockery of discretion. She was a vision in a figure-hugging silk dress, her lips painted scarlet, hair cascading in waves that shimmered like spun gold. She clutched his arm possessively, the faint scent of her expensive perfume trailing in the air as though she wanted the entire world to know she belonged to him. And Alexander allowed it. He strutted across the marble steps with her at his side, projecting the arrogance of a man who thought rules, vows, and morality existed only for others. Inside, the spa lobby gleamed with white marble floors polished to a mirror's shine. Cascading fountains murmured softly, their waters catching the warm glow of chandeliers shaped like falling stars. A soft mist of essential oils perfumed the air, mingling with the tranquil sounds of string music that floated invisibly through hidden speakers. It was a temple of indulgence, designed to soothe souls who already had everything. The staff, dressed in crisp uniforms of ivory and gold, moved with rehearsed elegance, bowing ever so slightly as Alexander passed. Their gazes, though lowered, flickered briefly toward him and Vanessa. The whispers began before they were even 10 steps inside. "That's Alexander Blackwood," one attendant murmured. "With his companion," another replied, their voice edged with hesitation. The murmurs weren't loud enough to reach him, but he didn't need to hear them. He thrived on it, the stares, the curiosity, the hushed disapproval that only fed his ego. To him, whispers were applause in disguise. He adjusted his cufflinks, his lips curling into a smug half-smile as if he had staged the entire scene. For Alexander, life itself was a performance, and today, the spa was just another stage where he could flaunt his dominance, his wealth, and the mistress who hung on his arm like the ultimate accessory. Alexander's confident stride slowed the moment he entered the heart of the lobby. He was used to being greeted by nothing but polished marble, hushed reverence, and perhaps the faint chime of a receptionist's voice. But today, something else caught his eye, a towering promotional banner stretching from floor to ceiling, draped across the far wall like a silent proclamation. His gaze froze, his breath caught mid-chest. For an instant, it was as though the entire spa vanished around him. There she was. Isabella. His wife. His pregnant wife. Her image glowed with a radiance he had not seen in years, if ever. Dressed in a flowing white gown that draped gracefully over her rounded belly, she looked ethereal, almost untouchable, as though she had stepped out of a dream. Her serene smile lit up the banner, eyes shining with the kind of quiet strength that mocked the man standing below it. The spa had chosen her as the face of their new maternity wellness campaign, and her presence filled every corner of the lobby. Alexander, who had entered believing himself the star of any room, suddenly felt smaller than he ever had in his life. His jaw tightened, his pulse thundering in his ears. This was supposed to be his sanctuary, a place where he could flaunt Vanessa without consequence. Instead, Isabella's luminous face stared down at him like a silent judge, exposing his betrayal in the cruelest, most public way possible. His confidence, the shield he carried everywhere, cracked like fragile glass. Vanessa, at first, didn't notice. She was busy preening, tossing her golden hair over one shoulder, ensuring that everyone saw her beside the great Alexander Blackwood. But when she caught the stiffness in his posture, she followed his gaze. Her painted lips parted, then curved into a slow, sharp smile. She tilted her head, studying the banner as if it were a delightful joke. "Well, well," she murmured softly, her voice dripping with amusement. "Isn't she glowing? Almost angelic." The words, though whispered, stung him like acid. Alexander tore his eyes from Isabella's image and scanned the room, but it was no use. Everywhere he turned, Isabella's presence lingered, her photograph framed near the reception desk, pamphlets displaying her smile neatly stacked for guests to take. Staff members glanced nervously between the towering man and the banner, their whispers growing bolder now. "Isn't that his wife? And she's pregnant." The words darted around him like arrows. Vanessa, sensing the humiliation blooming on his face, pressed closer, her nails digging slightly into his arm. Yet beneath her smirk was something darker, a flicker of unease. If Isabella had risen to such prominence, what did that mean for Vanessa's place? For the first time, she felt overshadowed, threatened by a woman she had dismissed as broken and abandoned. Alexander swallowed hard, his throat dry. For years he had built an empire of control, of carefully crafted appearances. And now, with a single image, Isabella had unraveled it all. Not with anger, not with revenge, but with her quiet, radiant strength. Years before the scandal, before the whispers and humiliation, Alexander and Isabella's story had begun like something out of a fairy tale. They met at a charity gala, one of those glittering affairs where champagne flowed endlessly and chandeliers sparkled like frozen stars. Isabella had not been the wealthiest woman in the room, nor the boldest. She wore a simple emerald green gown that night, her dark hair swept back elegantly, her laughter genuine and unforced. While others tried desperately to impress Alexander Blackwood, she had been the only one who looked at him not as a millionaire, not as a man of power, but simply as a man. And that, ironically, was what captured him. Alexander, in those early days, had been different. The arrogance was there, yes, but it was tempered by charm, by a desire to be loved not just for what he owned but for who he could be. With Isabella, he felt grounded. Their courtship was swift, filled with stolen moments, midnight drives, and promises whispered under the stars. When he proposed, it wasn't with a boardroom strategy or a grand gesture meant to outshine rivals. It was quiet, intimate, heartfelt. He had taken her to the very first cafe they ever visited together, dropping to one knee with nothing but sincerity in his eyes. Isabella, overwhelmed with emotion, had said yes without hesitation. Marriage in the beginning was blissful. Their home was warm, not just with wealth but with love. Isabella supported him in every endeavor, cheering on his business ventures even when they demanded long hours and endless travel. She learned to navigate his world of shareholders and investors, always by his side at functions, her elegance disarming even his harshest critics. She put her own dreams on hold, plans of starting a small art gallery, of traveling through Europe with nothing but a sketchbook and time, because Alexander's ambitions always came first. She believed in him, in the man she thought he was. But success has a way of reshaping men. The more Alexander climbed, the more ruthless he became. Deals consumed him, and soon it wasn't enough to simply be successful. He craved dominance, to be whispered about as untouchable. With power came attention, and with attention came temptation. At first, it was subtle. Longer business trips, unexplained late nights at the office, the lingering scent of unfamiliar perfume on his suits. Isabella noticed, but she told herself it was stress, that he loved her too much to betray her. Her loyalty was a shield she clung to, even as cracks began to show. Alexander, meanwhile, grew addicted to the thrill. The admiration of other women, the whispers of being desired not just for his money but for his presence. It fed his ego like nothing else. Isabella's quiet devotion, once his anchor, began to feel too ordinary. He wanted spectacle, fire, and the constant reminder that he was desirable beyond the safety of marriage. He began chasing vanity instead of love, trading intimacy for conquest, respect for reputation. Isabella endured in silence. She held her head high at public events, smiling as if nothing was amiss, even when the loneliness at home was suffocating. She told herself love was sacrifice, that her duty as a wife was to remain steadfast. She hoped, perhaps naively, that he would return to the man who once cherished her so deeply. But Alexander was already slipping too far into the abyss of his own pride. Where once he had seen Isabella as his equal, now he saw her as part of the background of his empire, stable, dependable, always waiting. He no longer noticed the pain in her eyes, nor the sacrifices she continued to make quietly for him. And while she fought to preserve their marriage, he was already seeking validation elsewhere, blinded by the applause of a world that would one day delight in watching him fall. Isabella had always known heartbreak was a possibility in marriage, but she never imagined it would come to her so brutally, so publicly. The whispers, the late nights, the lingering smell of perfume she didn't wear, all of it had pointed to betrayal. When the truth of Alexander's infidelity settled like ice in her chest, she expected to shatter. Yet, the strange thing was, she didn't. She cried, yes, in the lonely hours of the night when no one was watching. She mourned the love she had lost, the dreams she had once built around a man who no longer saw her. But when morning came, she stood tall, because she refused to be defined by the choices of a man who had forgotten her worth. Pregnancy should have been a vulnerable time, one where she leaned on her husband for support, but instead, it became her crucible. Every flutter within her reminded her that she wasn't weak, that she carried within her the greatest symbol of resilience, a new life. Her child gave her purpose, a reason to rise above humiliation, a reason to turn her pain into power. And so, she stopped waiting for Alexander to notice her. She stopped begging for scraps of affection. Instead, she began crafting a new version of herself, one that existed outside his shadow. When the spa approached her to become the face of their maternity wellness campaign, Isabella hesitated. At first, it felt almost cruel, a spotlight she wasn't sure she wanted. She had spent so long hiding her wounds, pretending everything was fine. But then she looked in the mirror one evening, really looked at herself. Her belly was round and full of promise, her eyes lined with exhaustion but also with determination. She realized she wasn't just a betrayed wife. She was a woman carrying both heartbreak and hope, and that was something worth showing the world. She said yes. The photo shoot was unlike anything she expected. Soft fabrics draped over her, natural light pouring through windows, capturing her as she held her belly with quiet reverence. She wasn't asked to smile with forced joy, she was asked to be herself, to show the dignity, the sorrow, the strength that lived inside her. The photographer whispered, "You look like a queen," and for the first time in months, Isabella believed it. She didn't need Alexander's validation, nor society's pity. She had herself, and that was enough. When the campaign launched, Isabella saw her image for the first time on glossy pages and glowing banners. She felt a pang of fear. What if people only saw the scandal, the irony of the millionaire's pregnant wife standing tall while he flaunted another woman? But instead, the response was overwhelming. Strangers praised her strength, women admired her poise, and the spa hailed her as the embodiment of grace through change. Isabella smiled to herself, because this wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about Alexander at all. It was about reclaiming her story, about standing in her own light after years of standing in someone else's. And deep down, she knew, this was only the beginning. Vanessa had never been the type to sit quietly in the background. She had clawed her way into Alexander's life with the precision of a strategist, every move calculated, every word chosen to stroke his pride. She knew exactly how to feed his ego, telling him he was the smartest man in the room, the most powerful, the most desirable. She draped herself in expensive gowns he bought her, laughed a little too loudly at his jokes, and reminded him constantly that Isabella was holding him back while she, Vanessa, could be his equal. Her ambition was not simply to be the mistress. Vanessa wanted the crown, the ring, the public acknowledgement. She fantasized about the day Isabella would be discarded, when she would step into her place not as a hidden secret but as the official Mrs. Blackwood. Every encounter, every carefully orchestrated appearance at Alexander's side, was designed to push him further away from his wife. She whispered poison into his ear, about how Isabella was too plain, too dependent, too boring for a man of his stature. And Alexander, drunk on vanity, let those words seep into him like wine. But Vanessa's power was fragile, dependent entirely on Alexander's desire. And the moment they walked into the spa lobby, the sight of Isabella's face staring down at them from the grand banner rattled her more than she cared to admit. For months, she had told herself Isabella was finished, a relic of a life Alexander no longer wanted. Yet here was the pregnant wife, glowing, elevated, celebrated. Isabella wasn't hidden away in humiliation. She was front and center, her beauty and strength immortalized for the world to see. Vanessa's smile, sharp and mocking, barely hid the twist of insecurity in her gut. She hated that Isabella, without scheming or seduction, commanded more admiration than she ever could. People weren't whispering about Vanessa in the spa. Their eyes were fixed on Isabella's image, their voices filled with awe. For the first time, Vanessa felt a sliver of fear. If Isabella could rise from betrayal and become a symbol of grace, what did that mean for her? That fear quickly turned to jealousy, and jealousy to rage. She dug her nails into Alexander's arm a little harder, her voice low and sweet but edged with venom. She would not be overshadowed. If Isabella wanted to shine, Vanessa would find a way to eclipse her. And in that moment, the seeds of a bitter, dangerous rivalry were planted, one that would force Alexander into a storm he could no longer control. Alexander straightened his shoulders, forcing his expression back into its usual mask of superiority. The moment of shock that had stolen the air from his lungs had to be buried quickly, hidden beneath the arrogance he wore like armor. He adjusted his cufflinks again, a familiar gesture he used whenever his control threatened to slip. "Come," he told Vanessa, his voice cool, clipped, as though nothing at all was wrong. He strode toward the reception desk with deliberate calm, as if daring anyone to suggest that the sight of his wife's glowing face on the banner had rattled him. But the truth was written in the room around him. Guests seated on velvet lounge chairs lifted their eyes from glossy magazines, whispers rustling like a low wind through the lobby. The staff, trained to maintain polite smiles, faltered. Their gazes flicked from the towering banner to the man beneath it, the irony too sharp to ignore. Isabella's serene smile loomed above Alexander like a crown, while he stood beneath it with a mistress clinging to his arm. "Isn't that her husband?" one woman whispered, not nearly soft enough. "And with another woman?" another replied, scandal coloring her tone. Each murmur sliced at Alexander's pride. For a man who thrived on admiration, who walked into rooms expecting the world to bend around him, it was unbearable. He told himself he didn't care, that their voices were nothing. Yet, every word echoed in his skull, louder than the next. He clenched his jaw until the muscle jumped, his polished shoes clicking against marble like the march of a soldier under fire. Vanessa noticed. She always noticed. At first, she smirked, finding amusement in the way Isabella's image had unsettled him. But as the whispers grew, and as Alexander's silence stretched too long, her amusement soured. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. He was supposed to laugh, to mock Isabella's face plastered across the spa. Instead, his grip on her hand had slackened, his stride faltered just slightly, as though the sight of his wife's strength had punctured a hole in his confidence. "Darling," Vanessa murmured, leaning closer, her nails biting into his sleeve. "Ignore them. They're nobodies." But her voice lacked conviction. What unsettled her wasn't the whispers themselves, it was Alexander's reaction to them. For the first time, she saw uncertainty in him, cracks in the flawless facade she had relied upon. The great Alexander Blackwood looked human, vulnerable, and it infuriated her. By the time they reached the reception desk, Vanessa's anger simmered beneath her painted smile. She despised the way Isabella's presence lingered in the air like a ghost, despised even more the way Alexander couldn't shake it off. He might have been standing beside her, but his thoughts were already elsewhere, trapped in the gaze of the woman he had betrayed. And Vanessa knew one thing with a cold, bitter certainty. If Isabella's strength could rattle him this much, she had far more power than Vanessa ever feared. That realization was poison in her veins, and it burned hotter with every stolen glance Alexander gave the banner above them. The campaign launched on a quiet Tuesday morning, but by noon, Isabella's face was everywhere. Her image graced glossy magazines, digital billboards in the city, and every corner of social media feeds. The photograph of her in flowing white, hands resting gracefully on her rounded belly, carried a power no one expected. She wasn't just beautiful, she radiated strength, dignity, and a kind of peace that seemed untouchable. The spa's tagline, "Wellness begins with strength," paired with her luminous presence, struck a chord far beyond its intended audience. Within hours, hashtags with her name began trending. Strangers wrote captions about resilience, women shared her image with words like grace, empowerment, and queen. Mothers-to-be said she inspired them, while others saw her as a reminder that betrayal didn't define a woman. Her response did. Isabella, who once lived in the shadows of her husband's power, was now being celebrated as a beacon of independence. For Alexander, however, the campaign was a nightmare. Paparazzi who once adored photographing him with Vanessa now circled like vultures. Cameras flashed as he exited restaurants. Reporters shouted questions that made his blood boil. "Mr. Blackwood, how does it feel to see your wife celebrated while you flaunt your mistress?" "Alexander, is it true Isabella refused to comment on your affair? Does her silence shame you?" Every headline painted him the same way: the unfaithful husband, the millionaire who couldn't break her. Articles praised Isabella's dignity for not responding publicly, for simply living her truth, while tearing him apart for arrogance and indiscretion. His carefully crafted image as an untouchable mogul was crumbling, brick by brick, replaced with ridicule and disdain. Vanessa hated it even more than he did. When paparazzi caught her at Alexander's side, their captions weren't flattering. They called her the mistress, the opportunist, the shadow trying to steal the crown. While Isabella's elegance was immortalized in glossy spreads, Vanessa's photos were dissected with venom, her smiles labeled smug, her presence described as hollow. She began snapping at Alexander behind closed doors, demanding he fix it, demanding he remind the world who truly held power. But Alexander couldn't control the narrative anymore. Isabella had stolen it without even trying. Meanwhile, Isabella's star only rose higher. Invitations from talk shows and interviews flooded in, though she declined most. She chose silence over spectacle, letting her image and quiet grace speak for her. The less she said, the more the world admired her. Women in boardrooms, mothers at home, even young students, everyone seemed to see a piece of themselves in her story. She became more than a wife betrayed. She became a symbol of survival, a reminder that dignity in the face of betrayal was more powerful than revenge. Alexander watched all of this unfold like a man drowning. He was used to commanding attention, to being envied and feared. Now he was mocked. Isabella's success wasn't loud or vengeful, yet it pierced deeper than any scandal could. For the first time, he realized he wasn't the author of this story anymore. Isabella was. And the world was turning its gaze toward her, leaving him behind in the wreckage of his own arrogance. Alexander had tried to ignore it. He had tried to tell himself the campaign was a passing wave, a stunt that would die down once the next glittering distraction caught society's eye. But when he found himself once again in the spa lobby, Isabella's face staring down at him from the massive banner, he couldn't restrain himself any longer. Rage bubbled beneath his skin, not because Isabella had humiliated herself, but because she had humiliated him. And so, like a predator cornering prey, he sought her out. He found her in one of the spa's quiet lounges, seated near a wall of glass that opened to a view of serene gardens. Isabella was dressed simply in a flowing pale blue gown, her hair tied back, her hands resting protectively on her belly. She looked at peace, surrounded by the calm atmosphere, but when Alexander entered, the air shifted like a storm cloud rolling in. "You," he hissed, striding forward, his voice low but filled with fury. "What game are you playing?" Isabella lifted her gaze, unhurried, her expression unreadable. "Game," she repeated softly, as though the word were foreign to her. "Don't act innocent with me," Alexander snapped. "This," he gestured toward the magazine in his hand. Isabella's glowing image splashed across the cover. "This campaign. You think you can parade yourself around like some saint? You think you can make a mockery of me?" She tilted her head, calm in a way that only unsettled him further. "I didn't make a mockery of you, Alexander," she said evenly. "You did that all on your own." The words landed like stones, sharp and heavy. For a moment, he faltered, unused to Isabella speaking with such quiet strength. He tried to recover, his tone hardening. "You're my wife. You don't." "I was your wife," she cut in gently but firmly, her voice unshaken. "But I was never your property. I am more than your mistakes, more than the shadow you wanted me to stand in. I chose to do this campaign because I am carrying life, because I refuse to let your betrayal be the story my child grows up with." That is my truth. Not you. Alexander's lips parted, but no words came out. For once, his excuses, his charm, his arrogance, none of it worked. Isabella had stripped him of every defense with nothing but honesty. And then came the sharp click of heels. Vanessa swept into the lounge, her perfume invading the calm air like smoke. She wore a dress that clung to her like armor, her eyes sharp with venom. "Well, isn't this touching?" she sneered, crossing her arms. The betrayed wife finding her backbone at last. Isabella didn't flinch. She turned her gaze to Vanessa, serene but steady. "You don't need to fight for him," she said softly. "You can have him. Whatever scraps are left." Vanessa's smirk faltered, the venom in her eyes flickering with uncertainty. She had expected tears, begging, a plea for dignity. Instead, Isabella offered her nothing but indifference, and that cut deeper than any insult. Alexander tried to step between them, to reclaim control, but Isabella stood, smoothing her gown, her posture tall and regal. "I won't stay here and argue with either of you," she said, her tone final. "I don't need to. My life doesn't revolve around this circus anymore." Without raising her voice, without a single insult, Isabella turned and walked away, her every step graceful, her dignity untouchable. Vanessa stood frozen, anger simmering, while Alexander stared after her, his chest tight with something he couldn't name. Shame, perhaps, or the sharp sting of realizing he had lost far more than he ever intended. The lounge, once filled with tension, now felt emptier than ever, because Isabella had left with the only thing neither of them could steal, her power. Vanessa paced the length of Alexander's penthouse office, her heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor. Her usual confidence was fraying at the edges, replaced by a restless fury that made her movements jittery, almost ungraceful. The images of Isabella's radiant face, plastered across every platform, gnawed at her like a relentless storm. She had prided herself on being untouchable in Alexander's world, the woman who controlled his attention and flattered his ego. Now, all that power seemed to be slipping away, and the fear of losing it consumed her. "Alexander," she hissed, spinning to face him, her eyes sharp and glinting with anger. "You need to leave her. You need to cut her out completely. Do you hear me? Now." He shifted uneasily in his seat, the tension in his shoulders betraying the conflict within. He wanted to command her, to dismiss her tantrum as ridiculous, but something in Vanessa's tone, equal parts fear and fury, made him pause. His pride wrestled with the truth. He could not erase Isabella's presence, not her influence, not the admiration she had garnered. And yet, the thought of leaving Vanessa, the woman who fed his ego and indulged his every whim, felt like betrayal too. I can't just do that," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. "It's not that simple." Vanessa's lips pressed into a thin line. Her anger flickered into desperation, sharp and ugly. "Not simple? You think this is a negotiation? She's stealing everything, your reputation, your control, everything I worked for. You're letting her overshadow us both, and it's unacceptable." Her voice rose, echoing through the room. The veneer of charm she usually wore had shattered, revealing the manipulator beneath, a woman who used seduction, fear, and flattery to bend situations to her will. Now, with the stakes higher than ever, her tactics became raw, demanding, threatening. Alexander stared at her, torn between the seductive pull of her fury and the undeniable truth that he was losing. His world, built on control and public perception, was unraveling. He wanted to placate her, to reassure her that he still had power, that he could reclaim the narrative, but even he knew that Isabella was untouchable now, and that no amount of anger or manipulation from Vanessa could reverse the momentum she had gained. Vanessa's voice softened just slightly, almost pleading. "You can't let her win. Not like this. You have to choose me. You have to." But Alexander felt hollow inside, the weight of his own failures pressing down. He realized, with a flicker of panic, that choosing Vanessa wasn't simple either. Her desperation revealed her nature, a cruelty hidden beneath beauty and charm. And in that realization, he felt the first true taste of helplessness. The mistress who had once been his greatest indulgence was now a weapon he could not wield without consequence. Isabella woke that morning with a sense of calm that had eluded her for months. The world outside was buzzing with chatter, headlines, and social media posts praising her grace and resilience, yet she felt none of the anxiety that once came with public attention. Instead, she was focused on the life growing inside her, the small movements and gentle kicks that reminded her of the new beginnings she carried. Motherhood was no longer a distant dream, it was real, tangible, and more empowering than she had ever imagined. Her days quickly fell into a rhythm that balanced preparation for her child with her growing role in the spa campaign. Meetings with photographers, wellness consultants, and event planners filled her mornings, but each interaction reinforced her confidence. She no longer sought validation from Alexander or the world. Her sense of self had become her own anchor. Every decision she made, from the clothing she chose for photo shoots to the charities she supported, reflected her values and her independence. She was a woman in full control of her narrative, and the world responded with admiration. Charity work became a cornerstone of her public presence. Isabella partnered with organizations focused on maternal health, early childhood education, and women's empowerment. She visited hospitals, spoke at panels, and lent her image to causes that mattered deeply to her. The media, which had once focused solely on her husband's scandal, now covered her as a force of positive change. Every article, every photograph, every mention strengthened her voice and amplified her influence. Women everywhere began reaching out to her, sending messages of gratitude and admiration. They told her she inspired them to leave toxic relationships, pursue careers they had once abandoned, and stand tall despite betrayal. Isabella's story became a beacon for those navigating their own hardships. She realized that her experience, painful as it had been, could empower others, transforming personal tragedy into collective strength. Even in moments of solitude, Isabella felt her independence settle like a warm light around her. Preparing for motherhood wasn't just about the practicalities of raising a child, it was about creating a life that symbolized resilience and dignity. She decorated the nursery with care, choosing colors and textures that felt nurturing and vibrant. Each decision, though small, became an act of reclaiming her power and her future. Alexander's shadow no longer darkened her path. She no longer waited for apologies or recognition. Instead, she thrived in the clarity of her own autonomy. Public events, media interviews, and philanthropic initiatives were no longer performances to impress others, they were celebrations of her strength, her choices, and the life she was building for herself and her child. By the time the sun set on another busy day, Isabella paused to reflect. Her pregnancy had become a symbol, her independence a statement. She was no longer the wife betrayed. She was a woman reborn, radiant and influential, inspiring countless others to recognize the power within themselves. This chapter of her life was just beginning, and for the first time in years, she felt entirely, magnificently free. Alexander had always believed that money and influence could shield him from any storm, that wealth was armor impenetrable to scandal. But the world he had built so meticulously began to unravel in ways he had never anticipated. Investors, once eager to follow his every directive, started hesitating. Board members who had once nodded unquestioningly at his plans now exchanged secretive glances during meetings, murmurs about his personal life bleeding into business discussions. The headlines and social media frenzy surrounding Isabella had turned from mere gossip to a stain on his reputation that no amount of charm could erase. Vanessa, sensing his vulnerability, became more demanding than ever. She pressed him for attention, for lavish displays of loyalty, for public gestures that would assert her dominance as the true woman at his side. Her voice was constant, sharp, insistent, an unrelenting reminder that his personal life was now a liability. Every attempt to placate her only deepened his exhaustion, fraying the nerves of the man who had once been untouchable. Deals that once closed smoothly now faced scrutiny, as partners questioned his judgment and stability. Meetings that had been his playground of power became arenas of tension. Alexander felt the weight of every whispered doubt, every skeptical look from colleagues who were beginning to see cracks in the veneer of his authority. No amount of wealth could shield him from the perception of weakness that now defined him. The irony was bitter. He had spent years cultivating dominance, chasing admiration, and pursuing vanity, yet all that effort now seemed meaningless. Isabella, the woman he had scorned and betrayed, had grown stronger while his empire of control teetered. Her image, her poise, and her growing influence overshadowed him in ways he could not counter, no matter how much money he threw at the problem or how many public appearances he staged. In private moments, when Vanessa wasn't demanding or criticizing, Alexander felt a gnawing emptiness. Power and wealth, once sources of pride, now felt hollow. He had traded the loyalty and love of a woman who had once been his anchor for fleeting thrills and vanity, and the consequences were inescapable. The man who had once commanded every room now felt powerless, a puppet tangled in his own choices. Each passing day reminded him that the empire he had built could crumble faster than anyone's imagination, and he was learning the devastating truth that some losses could never be bought back. The gala hall shimmered with crystal chandeliers, the kind of opulent lighting that made even the most confident socialites feel like royalty. Alexander had prepared meticulously for this evening, adjusting his cufflinks twice, checking his tie, ensuring his polished shoes reflected the gleam of the marble floors. Every detail mattered, every glance, every handshake, every whispered compliment was part of the performance that reinforced his untouchable image. He was a man who thrived on admiration, who had built his empire not just on wealth but on the perception of control. Tonight, he intended to remind the world why Alexander Blackwood remained a name to fear, to envy, to respect. Vanessa hovered at his side, her painted smile sharp, a silent weapon that reminded him of her expectations. She had spent weeks coaching him, reminding him to project confidence, to deflect attention away from any whispers about his personal life. "They're watching," she had said, "so act untouchable." And Alexander had nodded, believing that his mastery of appearances could still hold sway, even after the scandals. But nothing could have prepared him for Isabella's entrance. She stepped into the hall with the elegance of someone who owned neither wealth nor title, yet commanded attention effortlessly. Her gown was soft, flowing, pale gold that caught the light like liquid sunshine. She carried herself with serene confidence, her pregnancy only amplifying the glow that radiated from her. Guests turned instinctively toward her, whispers of admiration rippling like waves through the crowd. Every camera flashed, every lens angled toward her, capturing the quiet power of a woman who had once been forced to stand in the shadows. Alexander's jaw tightened, a surge of frustration and disbelief coursing through him. This was not supposed to happen. He had rehearsed the narrative, controlled the optics, and yet Isabella was rewriting the story with a single step into the room. She didn't speak loudly, she didn't demand attention. She simply existed, and the world responded. Reporters, eager for the spectacle, swarmed around her. Questions, flashes, and the hum of cameras created a whirlwind that left Alexander invisible, reduced to a man trying, and failing, to reclaim dominance. Guests approached Isabella with genuine admiration, praising her poise and her strength, while Alexander's carefully curated presence went unnoticed, save for murmurs of scandal and whispers of his infidelity. Vanessa's composure cracked beside him, her fury barely contained. She tugged at his sleeve, her voice sharp, but even she understood that this wasn't a matter of persuasion, it was defeat made tangible. Alexander felt the full weight of loss, not just of his public stature, but of respect, influence, and the aura of invincibility he had cultivated for years. Anger boiled beneath his polished exterior. He wanted to lash out, to reclaim control, to silence the woman who had eclipsed him so effortlessly. Yet, no words came, no action could counter the reality. Isabella had triumphed. She had risen above betrayal and humiliation, claiming a power he could neither buy nor command. As the crowd continued to surround her, the realization hit him like ice. He had lost everything that truly mattered. Not money, not luxury, not appearances, but the respect and awe that had defined his existence. And for the first time in years, Alexander Blackwood felt powerless. Vanessa had always thrived on power, not love. She craved influence over Alexander, the thrill of being his secret weapon, the mistress who commanded attention without the burden of commitment. But the evening at the gala had cracked the illusion she had so carefully curated. Alexander, once the unshakable force she had manipulated effortlessly, now appeared vulnerable, overshadowed by Isabella's radiance. For Vanessa, that vulnerability was intolerable. She had invested time in a man whose world was supposed to bend to her will, and now, she realized, it no longer did. By the following week, whispers of a new alliance reached the circles that once buzzed with Alexander's name. Vanessa, ever ambitious, had already begun circulating among other wealthy elites, her charm a polished weapon aimed at the next target. She no longer needed Alexander. In fact, he had become a liability, a fading star whose aura no longer elevated her own. She had calculated that staying with him would tether her to failure, and in her eyes, survival demanded abandonment. Alexander felt the shift almost immediately. Calls from Vanessa went unanswered or came with excuses. Her presence, once constant, now evaporated. The very woman who had fueled his ego and reinforced his dominance now treated him with cold indifference, leaving him grasping for the power he thought he possessed. Alone in his penthouse, surrounded by opulence that now felt hollow, he finally confronted the truth. The life he had built was a fragile facade, and he had willingly traded loyalty and love for fleeting vanity and desire. The emptiness of his choices pressed down on him with an unbearable weight. Vanessa's betrayal was more than personal. It was symbolic, a mirror reflecting every misstep, every act of arrogance, every moment he had dismissed Isabella's devotion in favor of temptation and ego. He had been stripped of the woman who had anchored him, the respect of the world that had once followed him, and the illusion of control he had cherished above all. Humiliation settled over him like a storm cloud. No amount of wealth could repair the damage, no display of arrogance could restore the admiration he had lost. Vanessa's departure crystallized a painful reality. He was alone, powerless, and forced to reckon with the consequences of a life built on vanity and betrayal. Every corner of his lavish apartment, every luxury he once took pride in, now echoed with absence, serving as a reminder that some losses could never be bought back. Months passed, and with each day, Isabella's life blossomed into a vision of fulfillment she had once thought impossible. The headlines that had once shocked Alexander now celebrated her for the strength and dignity she had displayed throughout the public ordeal. Invitations to speak at women's empowerment panels, maternity wellness forums, and charity galas became frequent, each one reinforcing her role not merely as a celebrity, but as a symbol of resilience. Her presence inspired admiration and hope, a beacon to women navigating their own challenges. Financial independence, once a distant aspiration, had become a reality. The spa partnership had grown beyond a single campaign into a series of collaborations, featuring Isabella as a trusted advisor and spokesperson. Her careful investments, combined with strategic endorsements, ensured that she could provide for herself and her child without reliance on Alexander's fortune. Security and freedom were no longer abstract concepts. They were woven into the fabric of her daily life, tangible and empowering. Emotionally, Isabella had found peace. She no longer carried the weight of betrayal in secret, or sought validation from the man who had once hurt her. Instead, she nurtured herself and the life growing inside her, allowing motherhood to shape her into a woman stronger, wiser, and more compassionate than ever. Each movement of her baby, each gentle kick, reminded her that the future was hers to define, and that the mistakes of others could not diminish her worth. Her legacy was no longer tied to Alexander's infidelity or the scandal that had once threatened to consume her. Instead, it was defined by grace, resilience, and the courage to reclaim her narrative. She held her head high in public and private, radiating an aura of confidence that seemed effortless. Friends, colleagues, and even strangers marveled at her ability to transform pain into empowerment, proving that strength is born not from privilege alone, but from endurance, self-respect, and the refusal to be diminished by others. As Isabella prepared to welcome her baby, she felt a quiet joy that no one could take away. Her life had shifted from being defined by someone else's choices to being shaped entirely by her own. She had emerged victorious not through vengeance, but through dignity. And in that triumph, she had found not only freedom and security, but the unshakable knowledge that she could face any challenge with poise, courage, and unwavering strength. Alexander sat in the dim light of his sprawling mansion, the silence pressing down on him like a physical weight. The grand halls that had once echoed with laughter, opulence, and the carefully curated hum of power now felt hollow, empty, and cold. His gaze lingered on the coffee table before him, where the spa magazine lay open, pages glossy, vibrant, and impossible to ignore. The cover bore Isabella's image, a radiant, glowing woman, her hands cradling her belly, eyes shining with serenity and confidence. She looked unstoppable, untouchable, a vision of life and resilience. For months, he had tried to reclaim his narrative, to suppress the whispers, the headlines, and the growing admiration for his wife. He had floundered amidst failing deals, Vanessa's abandonment, and the gnawing realization that the world no longer feared or respected him in the way it once had. And now, staring at that single image, the truth hit harder than any public scandal could. Isabella had risen from the ashes of his betrayal, transforming the very humiliation he had feared into a triumphant emblem of her independence. He remembered the early days of their marriage, the love they had shared before ambition, lust, and arrogance had led him astray. The memories that once carried warmth now felt like knives, reminders of the choices that had cost him everything meaningful. Every extravagant gesture, every calculated charm meant to impress or control, had been futile. Isabella's strength was unbought, unshakable, and entirely beyond his grasp. That magazine cover was not just a photograph. It was a mirror reflecting the power he had lost, the life he had mismanaged, and the legacy he had failed to secure. As he traced the edges of the glossy page with a trembling finger, Alexander felt a bitter sense of awe. She was everything he had failed to be, composed under scrutiny, radiant in adversity, and commanding admiration not through fear or wealth, but through dignity, resilience, and grace. Every headline, every social media post, every whispered word of admiration reinforced what he already knew. Isabella had claimed her life on her terms, and he was powerless to reverse it. He sank deeper into the leather armchair, the emptiness around him mirroring the hollowness within. The empire he had built, the wealth he had flaunted, and the relationships he had manipulated were meaningless in comparison to what Isabella had created for herself. She was secure, celebrated, and emotionally free. He was alone, haunted by the choices that had led him here. And somewhere in the quiet, Alexander understood that his greatest failure was not losing wealth or status. It was underestimating the woman he had once taken for granted. Isabella's triumph was complete, her radiance permanent. That single cover marked not just her rebirth, but the unraveling of his world, a permanent testament to survival, dignity, and victory over betrayal. He closed his eyes, swallowed the bitter taste of defeat, and realized the truth he could no longer escape. She had won, utterly and irrevocably.
And that wraps up today's story. Now we want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments, and let's see how far these stories reach. If this story moved you or gave you chills, give it a like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. One last thing, rate the story from 1 to 10 in the comments. Your feedback helps us bring you even better ones next time. Thanks for watching. We appreciate you being part of this storytelling journey.